3 different horrors taught me the same lesson too late. Evil doesn't break into your life. It sits down and asks you to trust it. Before the stories begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. The more you engage, the more these chilling tales will return to your feed. Now, let's step into the dark together. Some truths about marriage are learned far too late. You spend decades building trust, establishing routines, believing you know every corner of your spouse's soul. And then, one day, you discover a door you should never have opened. My name is Margaret. What I'm about to tell you happened 30 years ago. But its weight has never left me. Secrets are not forgotten with time. Secrets have a way of eventually coming to light. Richard and I had been married for 43 years when the strangeness began. We lived in Pennsylvania, in a modest colonial house with creaking wooden floors and far too many rooms for just 2 people. Everything was perfectly ordinary, or so I believed. Richard worked as an accountant at a local firm, a stable job, predictable hours. Our 3 children had long since moved out, leaving us with quiet evenings and a comfortable silence. Richard was not a complicated man. He liked his coffee black, his morning newspaper, and his routines unchanged. That is why what happened at first felt impossible. After 40 years, when patterns break, you notice. Sometimes, though, you don't realize what's happening until it's already too late. It all began with the attic. We had used it as storage ever since we moved in. Christmas decorations and old photo albums gathered dust there. Richard never went up. He said the narrow stairs hurt his knees. But one Thursday evening in October, while I was preparing dinner, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, careful footsteps, back and forth across the attic floor. When Richard came downstairs 20 minutes later, his shirt was soaked with sweat. I asked him what he had been doing up there. He smiled and said he was looking for his old college yearbook. He said he had been thinking about his former roommate lately. I nodded, slightly puzzled, continued stirring the pot, and didn't think much more about it. That was my first mistake. The visits continued. Every Thursday evening, around 7 o'clock, Richard would excuse himself and climb the attic stairs. Sometimes he'd be gone 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. When I asked about it, he always had an answer ready. Organizing old files, checking for water damage, looking for something he'd misplaced years ago. The answers were reasonable. They were also lies. I knew they were lies because of the sounds. Not just footsteps, but other things. Scraping, something heavy being dragged, and once, just once, a voice. Not Richard's voice, someone else. Muffled, indistinct, but undeniably human. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs that night, my hand on the railing, listening. The voice spoke again, clearer this time. It sounded like pleading. Then Richard's voice, calm and measured, telling someone to be quiet, telling them it would all be over soon. I didn't go up. I should have. God knows I should have. But fear is a paralyzing thing, especially when it involves someone you've shared a bed with for 43 years. Instead, I went back to the living room, sat in my chair, and pretended I'd heard nothing. The pretending lasted 3 weeks. During that time, Richard changed in small ways that felt enormous. He started locking the attic door, something we'd never done before. He kept the key on his keychain, always with him. He became protective of his schedule, irritable when anything disrupted his Thursday routine. And there were smells. Sometimes when he came down from the attic, he smelled like bleach. Other times, something sharper, chemical, like cleaning solvent, but stronger. He'd shower immediately, scrubbing his hands until they were red. One morning, while Richard was at work, I searched for a spare attic key. I found one in the basement, tucked inside an old toolbox. My hands shook as I climbed those narrow stairs, the key heavy in my palm. The attic looked normal at first. Boxes stacked against walls, old furniture covered with sheets. But the air felt wrong. Too clean, artificially so. And in the far corner, behind a stack of Christmas decoration boxes, was something that didn't belong. A mattress, not old and dusty like everything else up there, but new, still wrapped in plastic. Beside it sat a cooler, industrial size, the kind restaurants use. I knelt beside it, my heart hammering, and lifted the lid. Inside were ice packs. Beneath them, wrapped in plastic bags, were sandwiches, water bottles, medication bottles with labels I couldn't read in the dim light. And at the very bottom, tucked into a corner, was a driver's license. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and frightened eyes. Her name was Jennifer Carlson. The address listed was 3 towns over. I stared at that license for a long time, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Then I heard the front door open downstairs. Richard's voice calling my name. I dropped the license back into the cooler, closed it, and moved toward the stairs as quietly as I could. But I wasn't quiet enough. As I reached the attic door, Richard appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like I'd broken a rule I should have known better than to break. "I told you not to go up there," he said quietly. "Richard, whose license is that? What's happening?" He climbed the stairs slowly, his expression never changing. When he reached me, he took my hands in his. His grip was gentle but firm. "Come sit down, Margaret. We need to talk about something I should have told you a long time ago." What he told me that afternoon changed everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. Richard explained it calmly, methodically, the same way he explained tax returns and mortgage payments. He said he'd been helping people who were in trouble, people who needed to disappear for their own safety. He said he'd been doing it for years, providing temporary shelter while arrangements were made. He called it a network. He called it compassion. He never once called it what it was. I asked about Jennifer Carlson. He said she was running from an abusive husband, that she'd been in our attic for 3 days while her sister arranged transportation to a women's shelter in another state. He said she'd already left, that the cooler was just supplies he hadn't cleaned out yet. I wanted to believe him. God, how desperately I wanted to believe him. But the mattress was still wrapped in plastic. And if Jennifer had already left, why lock the attic door every single day? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside Richard, listening to him breathe, wondering who he really was. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps in the attic. Slow, careful, trying not to be heard. Richard was beside me, sound asleep, which meant someone else was up there. I slipped out of bed and climbed the attic stairs in the dark. The door was unlocked this time. When I pushed it open, the moonlight coming through the small window showed me everything I'd been too afraid to see before. The mattress wasn't wrapped in plastic anymore. Someone was lying on it, curled into a ball, hands bound, mouth gagged with duct tape. A young woman, not Jennifer Carlson, someone else. Her eyes met mine in the darkness, wide, terrified, pleading. She made a sound behind the gag, desperate and muffled. I moved toward her, my hands reaching for the tape, when the attic light snapped on. Richard stood in the doorway, fully dressed, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "I really wished you hadn't done that, Margaret," he said it. The next hours are fragmented in my memory, moments of clarity separated by blind panic. Richard didn't hurt me. That's what made it worse somehow. He spoke gently, explaining that this was necessary, that I didn't understand the bigger picture. He said the woman had been asking too many questions about his past, that she'd discovered something that couldn't be undiscovered. He called it problem solving. He called it protecting our life together. I asked how many women had been in that attic. He didn't answer directly. He just said enough. Enough that stopping now wasn't an option. I don't remember deciding to run. My body made the decision before my mind caught up. I was down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the back door. I ran through our neighbor's yard in my nightgown, my bare feet bleeding on the cold October pavement. Mrs. Chen, from 3 houses down, found me collapsed on her porch at dawn. The police came. They found the woman in the attic. Her name was Diana Morse. She'd been missing for 11 days. They found others too, not in our house, but in records Richard had kept, meticulously organized, dated, labeled. 7 women over 16 years. Some he'd released, some he'd moved to other locations. 2 were never found. Richard was arrested that morning. He didn't resist. He didn't deny anything. In his confession, he explained it the same way he'd explained it to me, calmly, rationally, like it was a project that had simply gotten out of hand. The trial lasted 3 months. I attended every day, sitting in the back row, watching this stranger with my husband's face describe horrors in the same tone he used to discuss grocery lists. The prosecution called me as a witness. I told them everything. The sounds, the smells, the locked door I should have opened years earlier. Richard was sentenced to life without parole. I never visited him. I never wrote. I sold the house and moved to a small apartment across the state. Our children stopped speaking to me, as if proximity to him had contaminated me somehow. I'm 88 years old now, and I still wake up some nights hearing those footsteps above me. Still see that young woman's eyes in the darkness. Still wonder how many Thursday evenings I ignored what I knew in my bones was wrong. People ask me sometimes how I didn't know. How I lived with a monster for 43 years without seeing what he was. The truth is simpler and more terrible than that. I did see. I just chose to look away, because looking meant losing everything I'd built my life around. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not that evil exists, but that we learn to live beside it, that we make accommodations, tell ourselves stories, adjust our sight lines until the monster becomes just another part of the furniture. Richard is still alive, somewhere in a maximum security prison. Diana Morse survived. She testified against him, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his face. I think about her often, about the courage it took to look directly at her nightmare and name it. I never found that courage, not until it was far too late. And that's something I'll carry with me until the day I die. Some doors should be opened the moment you hear the first strange sound behind them, before you've had time to convince yourself you're imagining things, before the footsteps become routine. If this story unsettled you, press like now, because the next one is even harder to face. The second story I need to tell you happened 15 years after Richard's arrest, when I was 73 years old. I believed I'd learned my lesson about ignoring warning signs. I thought I was someone who asked questions now, instead of turning away. I was wrong, because this time, the monster was not a stranger I had married. It was my own daughter. Catherine was my middle child, always the quiet one. While her siblings demanded attention, she watched everything from the corners of rooms, speaking very little. As an adult, she became a hospital nurse. spending her days tending to the dying with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. Everyone called her an angel. I called her dependable. She lived 2 hours away, in a renovated farmhouse she had inherited from her husband's family. James had died 5 years earlier at the age of 52 from a sudden heart attack, leaving Catherine alone in that large house with nothing but her work and her hobbies. James had been taken from us tragically early. After her husband died, Catherine began cooking seriously, saying it gave her something to focus on alongside her grief. She started a blog, shared recipes, photographed carefully prepared meals. People loved her work. She had thousands of followers. It surprised me how quickly she seemed to recover and find herself again. But as a nurse, she was not a woman encountering death for the first time in her life. I visited her twice a year, in the spring and the fall. The house always smelled wonderful. Something rich simmered on the stove. Bread cooled on wire racks. Catherine greeted me at the door with flour on her apron and that gentle smile that never quite reached her eyes. We spent the weekend cooking together, just as we had when she was young. During my visit in the spring of 2009, I noticed the freezer. Catherine had always been organized, but this was different. The large chest freezer in the basement was meticulously labeled, each container carefully marked by hand with dates and contents. Beef stew, March 3rd, pork roast, February 18th, chicken soup, April 1st. I found myself thinking that Catherine being this orderly was not normal behavior at all. Have you ever ignored a red flag because the explanation felt easier? Tell me in the comments. Then I realized there was something odd about the quantities. Catherine lived alone. Why would one person need 30 containers of stew, 40 pounds of various roasts? When I asked, she laughed and said she donated meals to elderly neighbors and church members who couldn't cook for themselves. She said it was her way of giving back. That explanation satisfied me at the time. Catherine had always been generous, always thinking of others. It made sense that she'd extend that kindness to her community. The discomfort started that evening. We were preparing dinner together, a recipe she'd been perfecting for her blog. A special braised meat dish, she said. Something unique she'd been working on for months. As she pulled ingredients from the refrigerator, I noticed her hands shaking slightly, not from age or weakness, but something else. Excitement, maybe, or nervousness. She asked me to chop vegetables while she prepared the meat. I didn't see what cut she was using. She'd already portioned it, wrapped in butcher paper. But when she unwrapped it at the counter, I glimpsed something that made me pause. The meat looked different somehow. The color was right, the marbling looked normal, but the shape felt wrong. Too uniform, too carefully cut. "What kind of meat is this?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Catherine didn't look up from her cutting board. "A special cut. Hard to find. I have a supplier who gets it for me." She moved the meat to a hot pan, and the smell that rose up was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Rich, almost sweet, with an undertone I couldn't identify. My stomach turned, but I told myself it was just something exotic. Venison, maybe, or wild boar. We ate dinner by candlelight, Catherine watching my face carefully as I took the first bite. The meat was tender, perfectly seasoned, but I couldn't finish it. I claimed my stomach was upset from the drive. Catherine's expression flickered with something. Disappointment, maybe. Before she smiled and said that was fine, she'd save the leftovers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The guest room was directly above the basement, and around 2 in the morning, I heard sounds from below. The chest freezer opening and closing, Catherine's footsteps moving back and forth, the distinct sound of something heavy being shifted around. I told myself she was just reorganizing. Meal prep like she always did. But my instincts, the ones I'd learned to trust too late with Richard, were screaming that something was deeply wrong. The next morning, Catherine left early for her nursing shift. She said she'd be gone most of the day, told me to make myself at home. As soon as her car disappeared down the long driveway, I went to the basement. The chest freezer was locked. That was new. In all my previous visits, it had never been locked. I searched for the key, checking drawers, cabinets, the obvious hiding places. Nothing. Then I remembered Catherine had a key ring, the kind nurses carry, with badge holders. She'd left it on the kitchen counter in her rush to leave. My hands were shaking as I sorted through the keys. The third one fit. The freezer opened with a soft hiss of cold air. Inside were the containers I'd seen before, neatly stacked and labeled. But beneath them, pushed to the very bottom, were packages wrapped in heavy plastic. No labels, no dates, just thick, carefully sealed bundles. I lifted one out. It was heavier than I expected, solid and frozen. Through the frosted plastic, I could see the contents. Meat, portioned and wrapped. But the shape was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. A human hand, fingers curled, wedding ring still in place. I dropped it back into the freezer, my heart slamming against my ribs. I wanted to be wrong. God, I wanted to be wrong so desperately. But when I looked at the other packages, I saw more. A foot, part of a leg, something that might have been ribs. The containers with labels took on new meaning then. The dates, the portions, the careful documentation. This wasn't meal prep. This was inventory. I heard Catherine's car in the driveway. She wasn't supposed to be back for hours, but somehow she knew. Maybe I'd left something out of place. Maybe she had cameras I hadn't noticed. Or maybe she'd been waiting for this moment, testing to see if I'd finally look closely enough to understand. I closed the freezer, relocked it, and was halfway up the basement stairs when Catherine appeared at the top. She wasn't wearing her nurse's uniform anymore. She'd changed into casual clothes. Her face was calm, almost serene. "I forgot my lunch," she said quietly. "But that's not really why I came back, is it?" I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Catherine descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. "You opened the freezer," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Catherine, what have you done?" She smiled then, the same soft smile I'd seen 1,000 times. "I've been taking care of people, Mom. The same thing I've always done. The dying don't need their bodies after they're gone. Why waste them?" The casual way she said it made my blood freeze. Waste them? Most of my hospice patients die alone. No family, no one to claim them. The funeral homes charge thousands of dollars for cremation. I offer them an alternative. She paused, tilted her head. "They're donating to something meaningful, to sustaining life, to my art." "Your blog," I whispered. "The recipes. People love my cooking. They say it's unlike anything they've ever tasted. And it is. Because they've never tasted honesty before. Real substance. The recipes work with any protein, of course. But the special ingredient makes them extraordinary." I backed up the stairs, but Catherine didn't follow. She just watched me with those calm, assessing eyes. "You're not going to tell anyone," she said. Not a threat, an observation. "Because if you do, you'll have to admit you've eaten it too. That first night, that special recipe, I was so excited to share with you. You said it was delicious. You said it was the most tender meat you'd ever had." My stomach heaved. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. Catherine was waiting when I came out. "I learned from watching you, you know. All those years with Dad, hearing those sounds from the attic, never asking questions. You taught me that the most important thing isn't truth. It's maintaining the illusion of normalcy." "Your father was a monster," I said, my voice shaking. "And I'm his daughter." She said it simply, factually. "The police found 7 victims in Dad's records. I'm at 23 now, and unlike him, I'll never be caught. Because my victims are already dying, already invisible, already forgotten." She reached out and touched my face gently, the way she used to when she was small. "You can leave now, Mom. Go back to your apartment. Tell yourself you misunderstood what you saw. It's what you're good at." I left that day. I drove home in a fog, my mind refusing to process what I'd learned. For 3 days, I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? And tell them what? That my daughter, a beloved hospice nurse, was harvesting body parts from dying patients? That she was cooking them and serving them to unsuspecting people? That I'd eaten human flesh at her dinner table? I picked up the phone 12 times, put it down 11. On the 12th time, I dialed the police. They investigated for 6 months. They exhumed bodies Catherine had cared for. They found inconsistencies in cremation records. They found her blog posts matching dates to patient deaths. They found DNA evidence in her kitchen drain that told the story she'd never speak out loud. Catherine was arrested on 17 counts of abuse of a corpse, desecration of human remains, and fraud. Not murder. She never actually killed anyone. She just took pieces of them after they died, before the funeral homes collected the bodies. She just ground them up and mixed them into her award-winning recipes. She just photographed them in perfect lighting and posted them online with cheerful captions. During the trial, she never looked at me. Not once. The prosecution asked if I'd known what I was eating that night. I said no. They asked when I first suspected something was wrong. I told them about the freezer, about the packages, about the moment I realized what I was looking at. I didn't tell them about the years before that, about all the visits where something felt slightly off, about the too precise labeling, the excessive quantities, the way Catherine watched people eat with such intense focus, about how I'd sensed something wrong and chosen to believe her explanations instead. Catherine was sentenced to 25 years. The judge called it one of the most disturbing cases he'd encountered. The media called her a monster. Her blog was taken down, but not before thousands of people realized they'd been following recipes that contained human remains. I testified, and then I disappeared from public view. My other children won't speak to me. They blame me for not seeing it sooner, for not stopping her before 17 people were desecrated. They're right. I should have looked in that freezer years earlier, should have asked harder questions. But here's what keeps me awake at night. It's not the image of that frozen hand. It's not even the knowledge of what I ate. It's the memory of Catherine's face when I took that first bite of her special recipe. The pride in her eyes, the way she smiled. She'd wanted to share her secret with me, wanted me to understand her the way I'd never understood her father. And in a terrible way, I did understand. I understood that some hungers can't be satisfied by normal means, that some people need to consume others to feel alive. I can barely eat anymore. Everything tastes like ash and guilt. I keep wondering how many other dinners Catherine prepared for me over the years. How many times I praised her cooking without knowing what I was really praising. My daughter is in prison. My husband is in prison. And I'm free, technically. But freedom doesn't feel like anything when you've spent your life looking away from the truth. When you've trained yourself so thoroughly not to see monsters that you can sit at a table with them, sharing a meal, and never realize you're eating evil itself. Some families pass down recipes through generations. Mine passed down the ability to hide what we are. Catherine learned that from watching me, and that's the inheritance I can never escape. If this story shocked you, leave a comment, even a single word. Silence is how monsters survive. The third and final story I need to tell you is the hardest one. Not because it's the most violent, though it is. Not because it destroyed more lives, though it did. But because this time, I was the one who brought the monster into our family. And I had 47 years to realize what he was. When I met Thomas in 1955, I was 22 years old and working as a secretary at a law firm in Philadelphia. He was 30, charming, well-dressed, the kind of man who opened doors and remembered birthdays. He worked as a traveling salesman for a pharmaceutical company, which meant he was gone for weeks at a time, visiting doctors' offices across the Northeast. The distance made our courtship feel romantic. He'd return from his trips with flowers and stories, treating me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. We married 6 months after we met. Everyone said we were perfect together. Thomas was an attentive husband in the ways that mattered to outsiders. He provided well. He never raised his voice. He attended church every Sunday when he was home. Neighbors envied me. Friends told me how lucky I was to have found such a devoted man. But there were always absences I couldn't quite explain. Not just the work trips, but the hours that didn't add up. He'd say he was visiting clients in Boston, but come home with mud on his shoes from somewhere that didn't look like city streets. He'd mention stopping at a diner I'd never heard of, in a town that wasn't on his route. When I questioned these small inconsistencies, he'd smile and say I was confused about what he'd told me. He'd say stress affected memory. He'd remind me gently that his job required flexibility, that routes changed, that sometimes he had to make unexpected stops. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. We had 3 children between 1956 and 1961. Thomas was a patient father when he was present, teaching our daughters to ride bicycles, helping our son with homework. But his absences grew longer. Sometimes he'd be gone for 3 weeks, returning exhausted, his clothes smelling like motels and highway rest stops. The first time I heard about the murders was in 1963. A young woman had been found dead in a field outside Pittsburgh, strangled, her body positioned carefully, almost reverently. The newspaper called it ritualistic. Police suspected it was connected to 2 other murders in Pennsylvania and Ohio. All young women, all killed the same way. I remember reading that article at the breakfast table while Thomas ate his eggs and read the sports section. I remember feeling a cold prickling at the back of my neck. Some instinct I didn't yet understand. Terrible thing, I'd said, folding the paper. Thomas had glanced at the headline and nodded. The world's full of sick people. Then he'd gone back to reading about baseball scores. Over the years, more bodies were found, always in small towns, always young women between 20 and 30, always during months when Thomas was traveling. The police called him the highway killer because the murders formed a pattern along major routes between cities. I never made the connection, not consciously, but somewhere deep in my mind, a map was forming. Dates and locations that corresponded too neatly with my husband's business trips. I'd look at that map in my thoughts and then immediately push it away, replace it with grocery lists and PTA meetings and all the mundane details that make up a normal life. In 1972, Thomas came home early from a trip. He wasn't supposed to be back for another week, but he walked through the door on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry. His shirt was torn. There were scratches on his neck. He told me he had been in a car accident, that he'd swerved to avoid a deer. But there was no damage to his car, and the scratches looked like fingernails, not branches. That night, another body was found, this time only 50 miles from our house. The woman had been missing for 3 days. She'd fought back. They found skin cells under her fingernails. I stood in our bathroom, looking at the scratches on my husband's neck, and felt the truth trying to surface, like something drowning, fighting for air. I pushed it back down. I cleaned the scratches with peroxide. I threw away his torn shirt. I chose willful blindness because the alternative meant destroying everything. This is the moment I should have spoken. Would you have? The murders continued for 30 years. Police across 6 states compared notes, built profiles, investigated hundreds of suspects. Thomas was never questioned. Why would he be? He was a respected businessman, a devoted family man, active in his community. His daughters adored him. His son admired him. And I kept his secrets without even knowing I was keeping them. The truth came in 2002, when Thomas was 77 years old. A cold case detective noticed something no one else had. The highway killer murders stopped in 1993, the same year Thomas had a minor stroke that forced him into early retirement. No more travel meant no more opportunity. They started investigating him quietly. They checked his old sales routes against murder locations. They found hotel receipts that placed him in the right towns on the right dates. They exhumed bodies and found DNA evidence that forensic science had finally become sophisticated enough to process. When the police came to our house, I thought there'd been some mistake. I opened the door to find 6 officers, their faces grim, asking for Thomas Walker. My husband came to the door calmly, dressed in his cardigan and reading glasses, looking exactly like what he was, a retired grandfather who spent his days gardening, and doing crossword puzzles. They arrested him in our living room. They read him his rights while I stood there, not understanding, not believing. Even when they said the words serial murder, even when they listed the charges, I couldn't connect that language to the man I'd slept beside for 47 years. Thomas didn't deny it. That was the most horrifying part. When they questioned him, he confessed to everything. 37 murders over 3 decades. He described them methodically, without emotion, like he was recounting business meetings. He explained how he'd select them. Young women traveling alone, hitchhikers, waitresses at highway diners who'd serve him coffee and mention they got off work late. He'd offer help, offer rides, offer kindness. They'd trust him because he looked safe, dressed well, spoke politely, looked like someone's father. He told investigators where he'd hidden jewelry he'd taken as trophies. In our attic, in boxes labeled Christmas decorations and old tax records. Things I'd walked past 1,000 times, never thinking to look inside. They found 37 pieces. Necklaces, earrings, a charm bracelet. Each one belonged to a victim whose family had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughter, their sister, their friend. The trial lasted 8 months. I attended every day, sitting in the same back row where I'd sat during Richard's trial, during Catherine's trial. People stared at me. The wife who never knew, the mother who'd raised a cannibal, the woman who'd somehow become the common thread in 3 separate nightmares. Thomas showed no remorse. When asked why he'd done it, he said simply that he'd enjoyed it, that killing made him feel powerful in a way nothing else could, that he'd been doing it since before we met, would have continued if his body hadn't failed him. He looked at me once during his testimony, just once, and he smiled, the same warm smile he'd given me on our wedding day, across breakfast tables, in church pews. A smile that had meant nothing all along. The prosecution asked if I'd ever suspected. I said no. They asked about the scratches in 1972. I told them about the car accident story. They asked why I'd thrown away his shirt. I had no answer that didn't make me complicit. Thomas was sentenced to life without parole. He died in prison 3 years later from complications of pneumonia. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't claim his body. The victims' families filed civil suits. I lost the house, the savings, everything we'd built together. I moved into a small efficiency apartment, living on Social Security, trying to become invisible. But you can't become invisible when you're married to a monster. The media called me the Black Widow, like I'd somehow attracted or created these men. Psychologists analyzed me on talk shows, speculating about what kind of woman could live with 3 murderers without knowing. The truth is simpler and more damning than any of their theories. I did know. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in words I could have spoken out loud, but my body knew. My instincts knew. That map in my head, the one I kept erasing, knew. I chose not to see because seeing would have meant losing everything. My home, my family, my identity as a good wife and mother. So I became an expert at looking away, at explaining inconsistencies, at accepting stories that didn't quite make sense. And 37 women died because I was too afraid to ask questions. I've outlived all 3 of them. My husband, the man I thought was my husband, and my daughter who inherited his hunger. I live alone in a studio apartment with bars on the windows, not to keep people out, to remind myself I'm already in prison. Sometimes I get letters from the victims' families. Most are angry, blaming me for not stopping him sooner. Some are curious, wanting to know what I saw, what I missed, what I chose to ignore. I answer every letter the same way. I tell them I'm sorry. I tell them they're right to hate me. I tell them I hate myself more than they ever could. Because here's what I've learned after decades of life. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it proposes marriage. Sometimes it helps with homework and plants roses and remembers to buy milk on the way home. Sometimes it looks so much like love that you forget to be afraid. My husband killed 37 women. My first husband imprisoned 7. My daughter desecrated 17 bodies. And I missed all of it. Not because I was stupid or blind, but because I trained myself not to see. Because seeing meant admitting that I'd chosen wrong, trusted wrong, loved wrong. I still have nightmares about those women. The ones Thomas killed, the ones Richard imprisoned, the bodies Catherine dismembered. I see their faces sometimes, cobbled together from newspaper photos and my imagination. They're always looking at me with the same question. Why didn't you save us? I have no answer that brings them back. I have no excuse that makes it better. All I have is this truth. The most dangerous thing I ever did wasn't marrying a serial killer. It was choosing comfort over curiosity, choosing peace over truth, choosing the man I wanted him to be over the man he actually was. If you're listening to this and something feels wrong in your life, if there are inconsistencies you're explaining away, if you're training yourself not to see something, stop. Look directly at what frightens you. Ask the questions you're afraid to ask. Open the doors you've been avoiding. Because the cost of not knowing is always higher than the cost of truth, even when the truth destroys everything. My name is Margaret, and I married a monster who killed for 40 years while I folded his laundry and pretended not to notice the mud on his shoes. If you've listened to all 3 stories, thank you for bearing witness to what I've spent my life running from. Subscribe for more horror stories, and leave a comment telling me which story disturbed you the most. Because once you start questioning what you've trained yourself not to see, These stories tend to follow you. Some secrets destroy families. Some secrets destroy dozens of strangers. And some secrets destroy the person who keeps them most of all.